Yes, please. Mrs. Rabeya Begum from SDS, Shuryatpur Development Society. Migrant Mahajan, Chief Executive Officer, CPRD India. MS Runa Khan, Executive Director, Friendship. Mrs. Rushati Das, Coordinator, Climate Action Network, South Asia. And Christian Wolf, ACT Alliance. So there is no preferences of seats, so you can take whatever you like. Thank you very much for joining in the podium in the today's panel discussion. Unfortunately, I don't have any seats, so I will be staying here because there are only limited seats to 6. I have dual role, in fact, just moderating the session and also develop a kind of context for today's discussion and to little bit touch on the recent decision on loss and damage fund. Before going to my discussion and before have a brief elaboration on the today's context, I would like to introduce the panelists to the audiences. First, I would like to introduce Pavel Partho. Pavel Partho works for BARCIK. BARCIK is a renowned organization in Bangladesh and has long years experiences in working with the communities for livelihood development, for addressing displacement and migration, and for human rights issues. So warm welcome, Mr. Pavel Partho, to the panel discussion. Then moving to Rabeya Begum. Rabeya Begum is the Executive Director of Shuryatpur Development Society. This is again a very renowned local organization, not national organization, have strong presence in grassroots. And they are working in one of the most climate change affected locations in the river basin areas. So warm welcome, Mrs. Rabeya Begum, to this discussion. Then Begum Mahajan, Chief Executive Officer, CPRD India, also has a vast experiences in climate change issues, adaptation, mitigation, policy discussion and discourses. Welcome to discussion. Then Runa Khan, Executive Director, Friendship. You all know he is very known face, not only in Bangladesh but also globally. She has been working in Bangladesh since many years with the disadvantaged communities who are being exposed to climate change impact, disaster risk. So we are very pleased that you are here in the panel discussion. Rushati Das, Coordinator, Climate Action Network, South Asia. She is leading a regional project on displacement and migration. Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Nepal is also part of this project. So we are eager to hear from you on the regional process of addressing displacement and migration. Then Christian Wolf, ACT Alliance, and very recently you published a report on displacement and migration touching on policy issues, how the policy frameworks could be developed for addressing these problems. So welcome you all in the discussion. As I said that I have dual role today, just developing a context of today's discussion and to touch on loss and damage fund, whether this fund is aligned to addressing climate change induced displacement and migration or not. I think Christian also will touch on this, but a brief discussion initially. When we talk about regional context of displacement and migration, the displacement and migration is a very old issue. If I refer to IPCC's first assessment report that published in 1991, it says that one of the most challenging issues of climate change would be addressing displacement and migration by the impacts of climate change. And there are many figures that by 2030, 2050, millions of people will be displaced and migrated. And that figure is very true for the countries that are most exposed to the disaster risk. For instance, Bangladesh, for instance, India, Pakistan, Nepal, because we are experiencing more intense and more frequent disaster events. More frequent means in terms of if you consider cyclone, if you consider riverbank erosion, if you consider monsoon flooding, that are becoming frequent and intense. And all the disasters are forcing people to be displaced. So when we talk about displacement, displacement is forced. But on the other hand, when we make a connection to those disasters to climate change, that the disasters are increasing by number. Disasters are increasing not only by number but also their strength. So there is a close connection to the disasters and climate change, and there is also a close connection to the disasters and displacement. But when we talk about disasters, disaster is not apolitical, disaster is political. So disaster impacts are political. So the displacement and migration that are being increased by the disaster that are political. So we are expecting a political solutions for addressing this problem. But unfortunately, if we look into the context, if we look into the global negotiations, global decisions, since 1992, there is no pertinent discussion, decision for addressing climate change induced displacement and migration. We had a decision under Cancun Adaptation Framework back in 2010 at COP16. There was a particular para on climate change induced displacement and migration, but we lost this because we provided our entire focus on loss and damages, because we thought that if we have a comprehensive plans and financing for addressing loss and damage, then we could fit in displacement migration to the loss and damage discourse, but we failed this. The problem is that the national narrative and also regional narrative on displacement and migration is not communicated in better way to the global discourses. And the voices of civil society, though we are talking about displacement and migration, but we are failing to convince the political leadership at the UNFCCC to include displacement and migration as a major agenda item. But concern is that still we have time, still we have scope to flag in this issue under the UNFCCC discussion, so that we can fight or we can advocate for a standalone agenda item that will leading to a development of a standalone legal framework or protection mechanism for addressing displacement migration. So, having said that, I am going to the panel discussion for their elaborate thoughts and discussion and recommendation to the topic. First, I would like to request Mr. Pavel Partho. As I said, that Mr. Pavel Partho is working with BARCIK, and BARCIK has a grassroots level experiences in terms of addressing displacement migration, not only displacement migration, but also other issues. I would like to request you to touch upon your experiences of BARCIK, how BARCIK is supporting climate change affected communities or displaced communities for their rehabilitation and relocation in a rights-based manner, rights-based approach. Again, is a logistic information. We have 6 panel speakers, so try to limit your speech within 7 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, respected, responsible delegates. I'm coming from a country, it's a very small country, the Bangladesh is facing the devastating the climate crisis, and also the people are fighting to cope with this type of the calamities and the disaster. Hope you know that the more than 6 million people are already migrated due to the climate crisis, and every day 1,000 to 2,000 people they migrate and they come to the cities from the rural areas, and 19 million children are the climate threat in Bangladesh. So what are doing with these climate displaced communities who are living in the urban areas? We call them now, quote unquote, the urban poor. But they were no poor, but they bound to displace from their villages and lost their everything, their production, their agriculture, their fishing, their knowledges, and also when they come here in the cities, they deliver, and also they change their identity and lost their identities because they have no any identity in the city. Hope you know that the Kutupalong camp, the world largest refugee camp in Bangladesh. This is especially for the Rohingya refugee people, the communities. So Bangladesh we have the different kinds of shelters. The people can accommodate themselves in the disaster period, during the disaster. But we need to rethinking the shelters. It is the new approach of the Bangladesh to protect the lives and the livelihood. So through our experience, I'm just share with you some of the bullet points on the relocation and the resettlement. When we are saying that displaced community due to the climate crisis need to develop the mechanism of the climate finance and the funds for the climate migrant and also the climate displaced people, ensure their housing rights who have already displaced for the climate issues, and also they promote their urban gardening. We are working with the urban poor people and strengthen their urban gardening activities in the cities, because it's a help them to ensure their family-based nutrition and food in a time, and also they can share their food with their neighbors. So it can make a kind of the relationship, because they are mostly displaced from the different parts of the Bangladesh who are living in the quote-unquote the urban slum in the cities area. Strengthen the capacities to the urban resilience. So need to support the adaptation and also the education and also their health, and should be all the relocation and the resettlement process should be gender sensitive, also the culture sensitive, and should be the children and also the elder friendly and sensitive for the people with the disabilities. So I am talking in my issues. We need to change the narratives. Look through the climate migrant people's mirror, because I'm not sure in the COP28 is there any spaces for the real climate migrant people who already bound to migrated the displaced for the climate-induced disaster. So we need to ensure the meaningful participation of the climate migrant communities and peoples in every climate negotiation, also in the conference of the parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pavel Partho. As I understand your discussion that when a person or community forced to migrate from one place to another place, she or he needs to compromise many human rights, particularly rights to education, rights of housing, health, and women are the worst sufferer in the course of displacement or migration. So when we talk about resettlement and also relocation, we also need to carefully consider the rights issues so that we can ensure rights of the climate change induced migrants. So thank you very much for your brief statement within the limit, and we may ask you in second round discussion and question. Now I am moving to Ms. Rabeya Begum. As I said that she is the executive director of SDS, Shariatpur Development Society, and as I know that SDS work in one of the most climate change or disaster risk exposed areas, which is a big river basin area and also dominated by river-based chores. So that region is often affected by monsoon flood and recurrent riverbank erosion, and that also forces people to displace and migrated. And in 2018, as I heard from discussion, also some reports that a single event of riverbank erosion displaced more than 5,000 families, and SDS and other organizations also supported those families. So we are eager to learn from you the causes of the displacement and how SDS and also other organizations responded to that crisis, what were the challenges of addressing those crises. Please.
Thank you very much for inviting me here to share my experiences of supporting the migrated families in Shariatpur district. As you said, our organization, SDS, works in one of the most disaster risk and expressed areas. And in the recent years, climate change is also increasing intercity of disaster impact. Shariatpur is located at the downstream of Ganges, Meghna and Brahmaputra river basin. This river basin drains huge volume of monsoon precipitation, and upstream water flows to the Bay of Bengal. In the ways of flowing down, the mighty river flows causes of erosion of the banks. In the recent years, we are experiencing huge rainfall in short duration, also receiving huge volume of upstream flows, and they together are causing unusual flooding and riverbank erosion. As you already mentioned, in 2018, the erosion of Padma River engulfed 5,000 households, 12 kilometers of road destroyed, 7 schools are destroyed and drawn under the water, 200 hectares of cropping land are eroded, and 3 local markets eroded or destroyed by the erosion. Also, the government hospital, 2 government hospital building is eroded by the erosion that year. I have witnessed many families losing their all the belongings. I have also witnessed fleeing people from their ancestral households. Immediate after disaster, SDS and other NGOs, also the government organization started providing immediate relief support to them, but the support was not sufficient. We just provided some food and small amount of money for buying their immediate household essentials. That was short term also. We couldn't continue support for the long time. Though there was a need, we should support them for livelihood diversification, rehabilitation, and their safe relocation. Social integrations, but we failed to do this due to fund shortage. I have seen many migrated people living in a shared houses in unsafe condition, without any water, hygiene, and sanitation facilities. They even exposed to more risky condition in the relocated areas. They become further excluded and marginalized in the new relocated areas. I have seen many children dropped out from the school and engaged in child labor. And for the girls, this is more worst than the boys, because the girls started as a helping hand or domestic worker in the different houses. I have seen many adolescent girls is forced to accept early marriages by the decision of their parents. It is very common that a displaced family consider its girl child as a risk, because they might more exposed of harassment and sexual exploitation in relocated areas. Hence, parents consider marrying of their girl child as a risk transfer. Unfortunately, short-term relief support does not have the scope to address those girls, address those risks and vulnerabilities and losses. This is the limitation of the present humanitarian assistance. I believe that the economic empowerment, job creation for the women and girls are very crucial to recover from long-term loss and to address non-economic loss and damages.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I mean, this is very obvious that when we talk about displacement and migration, this is not a single event. This is extension of many crises and vulnerabilities, because the extension of secondary and tertiary risk level includes gender-based violence, includes increase of child labor, includes increase of early marriage, marriage of adolescent girls, sexual harassment, and all are non-economic loss and damages. But when we talk about addressing to that problem, then we try to link them to the humanitarian support. And unfortunately, the loss and damage fund that has been established at COP27, and we have some funding right now, that also tried to link post-disaster support to the humanitarian support. So the short-term humanitarian support is not an answer to the non-economic loss and damages. So this is the, acute challenge and limitations of loss and damage fund. I think Christian will highlight on this more, and we will look forward to hear from Christian. But before going to Christian, I would like to request Vikrant Mahajan. As I said, he is the Chief Executive Officer of SPEAR India, and I would like to request you to, share your experiences from India in terms of displacement and migration, and what are the policy right now in India and policy discussion to address that crisis.
Thank you for the opportunity. SPEAR India, I came from a humanitarian and a disaster risk reduction, disaster response network in India, and connected globally also for the main. And we see the disaster and climate now, the linkage is more and more strong, and that's bring us to look at how we look at the changes happening because of the climate and leading to more disasters, leading to more migrants and migration, and all put together. So how do we solve this conundrum, which is there? So I start with the loss and damage. I think loss and damage fund, the celebration part or falling short of the expectation part in this COP. But the fact that there is migration, and my fellow speakers are speaking about that, the fact that there's a migration, it's an evidence that there's loss and damage. And it's an evidence that this loss and damage is not being addressed, right? The fact that there is migration, there is migrants, is an evidence also that there is a failure of adaptation. Because if there had been an adaptation, probably the migration would not be happening, right? So we are in that situation where we looking at the scale of migration, especially in South Asia, the context we're talking about. The scale is, if you look at the 2018 study of World Bank, it says 40 million by 2050, which got revised to 60 million in 2020, right? So that's the scale of a migration is being estimated. Now, out of this, when we say that, 40% of India's, India, we are already seeing a different set of migration. We're yet to figure it out is what is this migration from rural to urban, how much of it is climate induced, say there is. But in next 13 years, the 40% of India's rural population will be urban. And a lot of it is being induced by disasters. For example, if I share another research statistics, India every year 25 million people get added to mega cities because of disaster. This is an established research which is there, right? The scale of kind of migration which happen in India, internally displaced, and these people adds up. Where do they add up? In the cities? Within the cities not planned for this incoming population. They burden on the city services, and most of the time they settle up in the places which are more vulnerable within those cities to occur disasters. And these are also the places where they don't have the services available in the cities, from the humanitarian point of view, which add to multiple complex vulnerabilities. I think this is there. So this is the impact and the kind of vulnerability or vulnerabilities within a vulnerability increase which we are trying to look at in this situation. Now, in this situation, we have to look at also the legal, context to this. So while there's a convention on the internally displaced people, right, and there's also a lot of migration we are expecting in the South Asian context is going to be cross borders, right? The cross border, the climate refugees, and the climate refugees context, I think, is South Asia has its own complexity with the way India, as such is not signatory to the refugee convention. So it adds another dimension and another challenge and complication, how we are going to look at the climate refugees and the climate movement cross borders, and within the borders itself, internal displacements, they're having not enough legal development laws to look at, how we're going to deal with these people who are internally displaced. I think there is a development need to happen in all the countries in the South Asia region. I think moving forward from here, these are challenges which we're looking at. So where do they look at solutions? I think the where I come from, this is again foresight is very clearly from in this data that a large scale migration due to climate is going to happen in South Asia, one of the hotspots there is. I think what can be done, I think what can governments do from the policy point of view is there is, so some advocacy recommendation is this. I think the governments should first of all identify the hotspots, migration hotspots, where the migration people actually are migrating to. It's also a recommendation is to look at, within these hotspots, create enough, start planning for infrastructure so that, the people are not adding to the vulnerabilities over there. And then, and when we look at these places, also is planning programs and schemes for these migrant people in terms of alternative livelihoods and those, so that they can get well absorbed to the society. I think we thinking not necessarily have to be there now about how to look at the prevention of migration. I think we have to get ready to accepting the fact that there's migration and start working on solutions around that itself also. So creating diverse livelihood opportunities for the migrants, direct resources to the semi-urban and peri-urban establishments where generally the migrants settle up, enable and boosting infrastructure there in these places. There's also a thought about, looking at developing, though it happens, sometimes it happens on its own, but it's thinking of developing the, especially cities or the smaller establishments, looking at the migrant workers itself and enable that with multiple different kind of skill building and other opportunities which could be there for the migrants over there. And this way also is an opportunity to bring the bridge between the urban and the rural divide. So that's something is there when we look at the more of a in migration from where the migration is happening, but also now what is it that out migration from where actually the migration is happening, right? So again one is thing important is to identify these hotspots of from where the outward migration is happening across South Asia. We identify those hotspots and there provide information and capacity building starts happening there itself. So the people when they migrate, they have enough skills and other alternative diversified skills which enable them to pick up the other opportunities elsewhere faster. So I think that's probably there. The schemes like the government of India generally have the various schemes. The schemes need to put into place which also look at these both the people at the outgoing hotspots and incoming hotspots addressing these requirements. And I think one analysis I came across is that the migrants make huge remittances. Even the internal migrants, the kind of a labor workforce which we see in mega cities in India, I think one estimate was showing is 100 million is a kind of a remittance which goes back to their communities. I think government need to complement these remittances and see where we can strengthen that. I know that I'm running out of time also is at the end of it, we all put the collaboration together as government, non-government, civil society collaboration and see how we address this thing from the humanitarian point of view, not just from humanitarian point of view, but a long-term requirements through various lenses. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think the narrative is somewhat common across the countries, Bangladesh, India, and in Dhaka also, Dhaka is receiving, thousands of migrants people maybe every day from climate hotspot. And there is a real crisis in urban governance, urban structure, urban facilities and other issues. I think this will come as a recommendation how we will support them with alternative livelihood options, with better services from the government. But a system change is required in terms of providing accessing to services and also making its cities better with better governance support. So with this, I would like to move to Runa Khan, Executive Director of Friendship, and as I said earlier, Runa is well known not only in Bangladesh, globally, and she has been working, and Friendship has been working the most affected disaster exposed areas. We call it river basin areas, chore areas, and before, starting our discussion on displacement and migration, Friendship and Runapa's organization is supporting that, displaced communities that are being displaced by riverbank erosion or flooding and cyclone. So we are eager to hear from you, your experiences, your support mechanism to the displaced communities in the hard to reach areas.
Thank you very much, and I'm so pleased to be here because I love sharing thoughts of any thoughts where migration shouldn't happen. And it starts right back from 1951 with the Convention of the State of Refugees, where they don't even recognize them as being refugees. So this was quoted the other day, and because of this, financial issues, of course, come in. Where do they fall in the financial bracket? They don't fall under the Humanitarian Act, nor do they fall, and they cannot be in the development funding. And they're not falling under the refugee funding. So where do they fall? So I think it's high time we step back and think if the 1951, we are going to stick to that. Has the climate changed? If it has, maybe we should revisit this also. There is this girl called Nupur. So Nupur, 2 years ago, just after COVID, comes from a family of 4. So she is 13 or 14 years old, and her father was getting her married. So there is all the friendship, group going and telling the father, oh, you can't do this, you can't do this. There's no way you can get a child of 14, get married. Not acceptable. We are going to call the police. The father turned around and said, okay, tell me what to do with her. I've got 4 kids. I've moved 4 times. I cannot feed any of my kids. This 14-year-old child has to walk at least to the bathroom and come back, or has to go and get something or play with her friends. Are you going to ensure her security? Are you going to ensure that I can feed all my other 3 children? If you can't ensure that, then why are you stopping her marriage? That is security. You see, migration gives rise to such incredible issues. We talk about loss and damage. Loss and damage is a kind of a loss and damage is the first step. Like disaster happens, then loss and damage happens. Roads break, houses wash off. People are left in a situation which is totally helpless and hopeless. And when that happens, there are all the other issues which we see, visible issues, health, education, access to finance, livelihood issues. These are one step, and then there is another step which is even beyond that. The step of mental health, the steps of child marriage, the steps, all these hidden social issues of wife beating, of children being violated. All these is another step. So the steps which lead far beyond loss and damage. Who compensates for this? Who talks about this? But it's as important as that road breaking and that bridge breaking and that school breaking. All these are important because all these are affecting that one human being that we all are in this room. So it's extremely important to look at the whole thing very holistically. And then we have, again, the issues of what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Because loss and climate, in a way, it's out of the hands of you, me, and us panelists. Climate actually the climate difficult loss and damage. Actually, the damage to the climate started not since we realized it's causing the damage. It started 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when development started in the first world countries. So it's not today, it's many, many years ago that it started. So we are facing the fallouts now, and it's accelerating now. And now it's high time that they start looking at responsibilities, and we all start, but fixing that responsibility is all of us have to be part of it. Whether we are instrumental in bringing that or not is not the question. But we have to be instrumental in not maximizing it. So we need to also look at our responsibility in that sense. What do we do to ensure that this migration, and there's so many different kinds of migration. I mean, you will, Rabeya, you will be able to tell us, because you are seeing this also every day. There is migration. Salinity has come in, we move from this field because our field doesn't have enough rice, we move to the next field in the next village. One kind of migration. We know the ecosystem, we know where to go. Then there is migration of island breaking to island breaking, totally losing the ecosystem. We don't know the socio-economic, political ecosystem of how we can restart our life. Then migration happens when you start coming to cities. You're again in a totally third kind of a migration level. And the fourth level, we haven't yet come to, but we are going to come to. And now the whole world is started, their eyes have popped, because it's going to be international migration. But migrations are in many different steps also. Then what do? We have to step back and go into a kind of a micro level work. In that micro level world, let's see how and what we can do to ensure that this migration doesn't happen. Small steps. So what do? We, as Friendship, I started providing healthcare services to the communities, hospital ships. Many of you know this. Now we have 5 new hospital ships and two other hospitals, healthcare system, education system, making people from the community, making them into teachers. They have some of the best results in the country. You will see 2 of our girls and you see how they speak English, even from these remote areas. Access to finance, agriculture, solar villages, because with solar, you can't imagine the difference it happens. You give them everything, you give them solar, immediately the financial impact multiplies. They can keep their shops open till 1 o'clock at night in a chore. Security, other chore people come to this market. Markets are blooming. So that is an economic development. People will not move from that island. In the south, mangrove plantations. In the south, again, we have the cyclone resilient houses where people can stay, and access even if they have disabilities or they are pregnant. So these are things that I think all of us are trying to do in some way or the other. Has to be done qualitatively, otherwise it will not work. Has to be done at the field level to ensure that this migration does not happen or happens less. Because at the end of the day, it's all about one person that we have to save. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You have elaborated, so many things. Historical perspective, responsibility of the developed countries, and also micro-level initiative. That's very important. When we talk about micro-level initiative, providing, enhanced access to support, providing the scope of education, and also alternative livelihood development. So there is a nexus between economic empowerment and social empowerment. If you ensure both economic empowerment and social empowerment, then we can address the challenge. And if we fail to do this, then again we are talking about intergenerational gap, because once a boy or girl dropped out from school, if he lost the chance of education, that entire life is lost. So it's the intergenerational loss. So we need to ensure that a migrant's family, whoever she or he is, we need to ensure basic services, education for social empowerment, and livelihood development for economic empowerment. So that would be a practical solution. Thank you very much. Now going to Rushati, and Begum, touched about cross-country migration, cross-border migration. And this is happening in between Bangladesh, India, Nepal. Sometimes political leadership try to ignore this because they consider that yes, people are crossing border, but they are legal, not illegally. But when people migrant or men or women crosses border without any legal document, then again that person faces many, series of human rights violation because he or she doesn't have identity. And in that context, CANSA, implemented a project, cross-country project, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, to understand the cross-country displacement migration, to sensitize the political leadership so that they accept this cross-country migration and can agree a kind of maybe very softer legal instrument or decision so that at least the rights of the cross-border migrants are ensured. So I would like to request you to touch upon your understanding and findings from that project, that regional project, and how far we are successful to reach to the civil societies for building a common opinion and also reaching to the political leadership to sensitize them for a regional kind of collaboration, cooperation. Rushati.
Yeah, thank you, Doha bhai. And before starting with the situation what Doha bhai has just right now said, I will touch upon a little backward. I will go backward because I just want to share the background from where this is coming from. We heard from Runa Appa, Rabeya Appa, and also from Vikrant and Pavel that situations are critical. Due to climate change, all this migration is happening with different names like displacement and other, without names even also people are giving. But why and from where this has started in 2018. CANSA as a network with other members in 5 countries started an assessment in that how climate change is affecting and how this migration is happening in these 5 countries. And we get numerous case studies like Nupur. We got from not only from Bangladesh, we found floods in Nepal, droughts in Nepal and floods in Pakistan. In India, there are, I can give you an example like there is a village naming as Ghost village in Uttarakhand because the whole village have been migrated somewhere else because they didn't have there's no more agricultural option is left in that place. So these kind of examples are there in all over the areas, all over the South Asian region. So after all these examples, after all these case studies that we came up, but we were trying to figure out that how these migrant people need to be get more better living, and when they are migrating, mainly they are migrating from rural to urban areas. They are then converted to as urban slums. They are not getting any dignified life, and then some people who had a little bit of capacity, then they are just moving from one country to another. Like in Dubai, we are sitting in Dubai, we all know that how many people, how many lots and lots of population from South Asia are coming as laborers in Dubai, as because they are not having any proper economies, proper jobs in their places, in South Asian countries. So yes, it is true that these migrant or displaced communities were not accepted by any political policies, or they have not been, there is no policy has been provided for them, so to get any proper livelihood or for their better life or any kind of jobs. But what our studies has been, after we made our studies, and we found that those migrants, they gave some recommendations from the ground. What they want as they're living, how they want to these recommendations to be taken to the higher level or the policy makers. then policymakers, and it is not easy to convince a policymaker that yes, climate-induced migration is happening in the ground, and they just say that okay, they can be accepting it. So these examples, these case studies has been taken, their recommendations has been put together, and I can give an example of from India that a private bill has been passed by the, put into the parliament from Assam into the parliament, and that this can be tell as one achievement from our project, and this kind of private bills or the influencing the policy makers through our recommendations are being done throughout the country, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and even in Pakistan, Nepal. So we are and many of the our partners are successfully now being the part of advisory group of the policy making team in the government, like in Sri Lanka, like in Pakistan, to influence the people that yes, this climate change is happening, that is true, and migration is also happening because of this climate change, and people are actually facing troubles, and so for their dignified life we need to do something, and so policymakers need to do something also. I will stop here now.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. You, rightly narrated the regional context, and it is important to, enhance civil society connection across the country. So the civil societies come forward to convince the political leadership to take up these issues, and this is very important. I think a stronger civil society network within the South Asian countries will help us for convincing the political leadership to address this problem. Finally, I would like to move to Christian. As I said earlier, you, recently conducted a study on this policy scope of addressing climate change. So my request is to, if you provide a brief summary of your study, particularly the policy spaces we have under the Paris Agreement, under the Convention, and also beyond. So Christian, I think you have a presentation, so I would like to request. Yes, okay, thank you.
And then I can move this with my magic stick here. Okay, good. Thank you. Yes, and thank you very much to the previous speakers. I'm a little intimidated because you had all very, very good research to share, and what we did was a rather modest piece. And I will just, what I'll do is really focus very briefly on how the issue of climate-induced mobility, migration, displacement has been dealt with, and sort of what are some of the takeaways already from the discussion this week, and how do we sort of rate the efforts of the international community to deal with this issue. So as Doa mentioned, Bread for the World and ACT Alliance came out with a report earlier this year, which is really meant a bit as a resource for our members and other organizations working in the civil society space to sort of just present how the relationships work between climate change and migration, and to identify what we see as the biggest gaps in terms of policy making, international law, governance, and then also to show people a little bit what are the entry points for civil society. So COP being one, we're all here this week, but there are others as well, and our concern was a little bit to get advocates who've been working on migration for many years and those working on climate for many years to stick their heads together more frequently and more strategically. So that was a bit the intention behind that. You are all climate experts, so I will not spend a lot of time on these couple of slides. You're aware, I think somebody mentioned this earlier, that since Cancun 2010, we've had the anchoring of human mobility in the UNFCCC framework in the form of talking about migration, displacement, and relocation. And this has sort of been carried forward in different iterations. I won't go into all the details, but one area that we've looked at, or that people in general have looked at, is given that that's the case, how have countries fared in terms of acknowledging this in the instruments that we have that are part of the Paris Agreement and the COP process? And so one of the two biggest areas are looking at NDCs and NAPs. And what's been found is that there's still a relatively small number of countries that have referred to human mobility in these plans. And that's also just a first step of integration. So, and this is always where the advocacy goes first. Like, we need to make sure these things are mentioned so that governments, when they report back, can take account of that. Now, beyond that, there's been very little references to other frameworks, which is something we'd like to see more of progressively. So what are the existing protection mechanisms in other frameworks, which I'll talk about in a minute, and that just hasn't been linked yet, and there are reasons for that, which we can talk about. Then there's, of course, still a lack of resources and capacities to develop such plans, especially on the part of many developing countries. And even those who have included mobility in such plans, like I said, we need more coherence between different policy areas, because at the moment it's usually the Environment Ministry that works on this. Some countries have specialized ministries, but they then often don't talk to their own disaster risk reduction people or to ministries that have to do with access to social services and so on, for example. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And then, as with other areas that I'll get into a bit later, there's always the question of lack of participation from affected communities and from civil society at large. In terms of finance, we're all aware, every time we talk about finance, we know that there's not enough of it, and we have to run after people for it. Now, in terms of mobility and climate, there are, in the instances that it's been mentioned, there are a few examples of where resettlement has been funded as part of climate finance, but really, otherwise it's barely been covered. We're now entering sort of a new phase of a discussion around that with the Loss and Damage Fund, which we'll get to in terms of how and where this could and should be covered. So another big gap that I wanted to mention here, since many of you also talked about internal migration and displacement, we really have a very big gap in terms of covering the rights of internally displaced persons. No social protection. This is, and I'll talk about this later in terms of laws. There are reasons for that. But it's something that's neither really well covered in the climate frameworks nor in the migration frameworks. And then, of course, we have, in general, a lack of funding from developed countries who are the main culprits for the climate change impacts that we see today. And we have to see now how we get human mobility better integrated into adaptation as well as loss and damage, both policy and finance-wise. And this is linked in part to the Loss and Damage Fund, which I'll get to in a minute. As you know, on the first day of this COP, the parties adopted the text for the Loss and Damage Fund. I just wanted to have a quick look at how this talks about or integrates human mobility. So there is the scope of the fund, which allows for access by governments, but also organizations and communities directly. We still have to see how this will work out on purpose. Climate migrants are mentioned and as stakeholders that should be consulted by the board of the fund. Although the methods for this consultation are unclear, that's something we're trying to get behind a little bit this week to find out how can we prepare the ground to make sure that the board is accountable, and even though there are no seats on the board for non-governmental stakeholders, we can take a certain degree of influence. The text also says we acknowledge the previous work done under the Convention on Climate Migration, and requests funds to be made available for this. It also mentions, which is important always in these texts, that existing instruments that we already have, which again are woefully underfunded, but they do exist, should include refugees and climate migrants in their activities. And then also refugees and climate migrants are mentioned as potential beneficiaries for more funding arrangements on loss and damage, which might be agreed in the future. So to build in a little headroom there. And then we have, you will have seen there's this weird arrangement of having a high-level dialogue in addition to the deliberations of the board, and this dialogue includes IOM as a regular stakeholder, which means, we don't know exactly what that means, it means that at least there is an agency that should have as its area of main interest the interests of migrants at its core, but they are of course not by themselves a representative of migrants, and they will say that themselves, so that's not just our opinion. So the issue really is how can we work towards more immediate participation of affected communities in the setup that we currently have under this fund. Okay, now let me switch for a moment before we come back to the fund and related things. So there are other areas of policy making that are not related directly to the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC that have to do with migration governance and with international law. So I wanted to mention briefly how climate and migration displacement presents itself as an issue in those frameworks. So let's talk a bit about law first. So we're looking at three main bodies of international law. There's international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law, which spell out respectively the state's obligations to protect human rights, to provide shelter and protection of other rights, and access to international protection. Now, the crucial thing to point out, and one of the speakers did this already earlier, that there's no specific legal framework for protecting climate-affected migrants, refugees, and IDPs, which then leads to people falling through the cracks of legal protection, especially in situations of what are called mixed movements, so where you have people on the move together, some of whom are refugees without official recognition, others who may be on the move for reasons which do not lead them to be recognized as refugees, which makes it very difficult to ensure their protection. There's one core deficiency in the Refugee Convention, which is always mentioned, which is that it does not explicitly list climate change or environmental change as a grounds for granting asylum, so for granting international protection. And there have been calls for the convention to be modified in this regard. There's a lot of problems which we can talk about around that. The main one being the political environment. States, even states who have ratified the Refugee Convention, have been sort of slowly chipping away at it, and trying to add more responsibilities at this point is probably not going to be a successful endeavor. So that's one issue. And then there are some notable exceptions I wanted to mention also. On the positive side, there are regional refugee conventions which have significantly expanded the definition of refugee and protection. One is in Africa, the OAU Convention, another one is the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America, and so on. And there's a Kampala Convention which deals with internal displacement in Africa. Yeah? So, but taken together, this lack of protection sort of puts migrants at risks for a number of different human rights violations, including labor exploitations, gender-based violence, etc., especially in lower skilled sectors of work and in specific migration corridors, including the one that was mentioned here already between a lot of South Asian countries and the Gulf. And I'll shift that other point to my next slide. Now, this is the legal context. Then we have a context of voluntary agreements between states, and I've just picked out one here for reasons of brevity, and that's the Global Compact on Migration, which is an agreement that states came to at the end of 2018 after the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, a lot of Syrians fleeing, and then countries realizing there are a lot of people on the move, and having forgotten that for the last 50 years, over 80% of people on the move has been harbored by developing countries, primarily in Africa, but also in Asia. So this compact came about, and there's also a refugee compact, which we can talk about separately, but for our purposes, the migration compact is more important because it has, among its objectives, two which focus specifically on the links with climate change. One is talking about climate change as one of the adverse drivers that compel people to leave their country. That includes a lot of actions for countries to take to prevent environmental damage and also to prevent forced migration. And on the other side, Objective 5, which talks about making sure that we have more and more flexible pathways for regular migration, meaning that people are not forced to migrate without having documents in hand and having a place to go. So what does this mean? Even though I said this is not international law, it's not a binding agreement, there have been several initiatives that have come out of this compact, and I just listed a couple here. One is a guidance note that was issued a couple of years ago to member states with the collaboration of civil society and a lot of different stakeholders on what to do, how can states or how should states make such pathways available. And so this document tried to define what is a situation of vulnerability, and under the different situations listed was also the impact of climate change to illustrate this a bit better to states. And then it said, okay, there are a number of responses that states can take to better protect people, including people that are migrating because of climate change, which included, next to the regular pathways that I just talked about, also temporary protection, visas that are issued in humanitarian situations, for example, resettlement, family reunification, and so on. And there was an appendix in the document that listed good practices that states have taken in recent years. And because of the point of time, it's kind of an interesting historic document now. It was issued in the summer of 2021 in the midst of COVID. So a lot of the practices were actually drawn from what states did to ensure that people that were stranded away from home in COVID situations could have access to their rights, which sort of, in my mind, connects to, we had a discussion the other day about climate finance, and somebody reminded everyone how easily and readily finance was available to respond to COVID, and how desperately we're now running after governments for $10, $15 million here for a loss and damage fund. So this is just an aside. One of the other initiatives that was done under the compact was a mapping exercise by the Platform on Disaster Displacement, looking at what policies do we actually have already, what are governments already doing in the area of climate change and migration. And the findings were not surprising. So there are regional differences because different regions have different types of climate-related disasters. But the biggest finding from our perspective was that there's actually a lot more that states are doing to address climate change as a driver, so everything that goes into the field of disaster risk reduction, resilience building, and almost nothing by way of pathways where it gets to, okay, what do we do in a forward-looking way to make it easier for people to move across international borders. This is an area that is very much underserved. So, I will go to the next, yes. Just to mention very briefly, on top of international law, on top of international agreements, there are regional agreements that are relevant for our discussion. And I'll just mention them here and we can get into them in the discussion where you want, if you want. There's the IGAT Free Movement Protocol in East Africa, which makes it easier for people affected by disasters to cross borders, even in a preventative manner. Yeah? There's the recently adopted Kampala Ministerial Declaration that was signed here, I think 48 hours ago, which does a similar thing, but is sort of more political in nature, because it also talks about financing and so on. And then there's the recently adopted Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility, which brought together countries in the Pacific region from a very interesting, progressive, human rights-based standpoint to say, we are acknowledging that climate change has this impact. What do we as governments in the region need to do to mutually support each other? So what do we see looking at this? One is that cooperation, most of these agreements is focused on the global south. You don't see a lot of these agreements being handed out or agreed to by countries in the north. And they are very context specific. For example, we don't have such agreements in South Asia. What we do have in South Asia is a lot of competition between governments. And I said this earlier to somebody, civil society is much better organized than governments are. So it's always, you always have to see this against the political background as well. And then the last page where I wanted to sort of stir our discussion a little bit is that just some observations from looking at all of this. One is that cross-border cooperation on migration remains the exception to the norm. A lot of countries are still insisting on national sovereignty when it comes to movement of people, which makes things very difficult. Misperceptions of migration as voluntary on the one hand and displacement as forced are very difficult when it comes to ensuring protection. And we see this in climate policies as well as migration policies. And the lack of pathways makes it very difficult for climate impacted communities to have alternatives. And then also we have sometimes this misperception that migration, especially from governments, that migration has to be a cycle and displacement is a linear event. So people, go somewhere, disaster happens, and then they live somewhere else. Whereas we know from experience very well that people don't stay there, that the disaster follows them, they have to move again. And migration doesn't mean necessarily that people go somewhere and then come back home. That's what most government wants because that makes it easier for them to manage it. It doesn't mean that's necessarily what migrants want. Yeah? So this has implications for policy. And then the question around adaptation and loss and damage. There is a tendency, I find, especially in the climate discussion, to look at migration as an example of adaptation and displacement as an example of loss and damage. We find with our members and a lot of the people we talk to that this is insufficient to reflect reality, because what happens is if you describe migration as a form of adaptation, you automatically assume that it's a free choice and that people are doing this willingly and with the intention to adapt to a difficult situation, whereas in a lot of cases it's sort of the end point of a very difficult process that might also have included displacement, for example. So the question then becomes, does that mean it should be covered under loss and damage? Do we even have enough funding for that? Or do we need to look at adaptation funding and make sure there's enough in there to also address migration issues? And then lastly, challenges of participation. As I mentioned earlier, most instruments do not adequately provide for access for local communities, and this is the big concern that we have under this big new complicated fund. How many years will it take for the funds to be dispersed? And as soon as governments get their hands on it, how many of them will actually put in place mechanisms that make it possible for communities to see any of that money? So I'll stop.
Thank you. Indeed, is a very, detailed, in-depth study. It would have been good to listen from you more on this study, and the observations are excellent, and we have the scope to work on this. We have around 20 minutes left for further discussion, and if we want to go deep in the discussion. But I would like to provide key headline messages for the panelists. Pavel Partho touched upon inclusive planning so that we ensure participation of climate change affected or migrants communities in the discussion. Begum touched about cross-border migration and also emerging crises in the urban context. Rabeya Begum talks about limits and limitation of humanitarian support, and humanitarian support is not the answer for addressing climate change, displacement and migration. Ruchi talks about social and economic empowerment, looking into the micro issues. Rushati does talked about regional CSOs collaboration for policy influencing, and Christian talked about, a broader policy narrative, scopes and challenges, and few observations. So with those headline or key messages, I would like to request the audiences, if you have any further clarification, questions, or even comments on the discussion, please feel free.
Thank you. My name is Shakirul Islam and I'm from Bangladesh. I'm representing a grassroots migrant organization called OCUP, Obibashi Gurmudnan Program. And it's very interesting. All are very prominent climate change expert here. So I'm very new in this area, but I'm from the migration background. So from all the discussions, it's already covered. It's very evident that the climate change has a very detrimental impact on the loss of assets, livelihood, and well-being, and that's how people are being forced to migrate or displacement. And Christian already mentioned there is a debate about migration, displacement, or it is said that yes, migration is more often a voluntary choice for the people, but when we talk about displacement, it's forced. So that's how we come, actually we have come into this discourse to bring the grassroots experiences, how migration is really forced when the adaptation fails because of the long-term assistance program for the affected people. I just want to bring one more issue in terms of the migration. Free to live and free to stay is the fundamental human rights of every person in this world, right? So when we talk about migration, then we should have respect these fundamental human rights, that the people have right to stay. If they do not want to leave their places, we need to make sure that they have all the facilities and access to services so that they can stay with dignity in their own community. On the other hand, if they want to leave their places, and in case, Runapa already mentioned that they migrate to their, closer nearby city or town or far-end districts, and there is also international migration. And our research is saying that 14% people actually forced to migrate internationally, particularly from Shamnagar Upazila in Satkhira. So my point is that if the people want to leave, then we really need to make sure that there is protection so that their rights are not violated, and there is also, need to create a legal or regular pathway for the people so that they can move safer way. So that's something that we are actually trying to put into this discourse, both in the climate change and even FC mechanism, and also in the GCM mechanism that Christian mentioned. It's again, global development on migration and development. So my last point is that we really respect the choice of the people and the rights of the people. If they want to leave, yes, we should support them, and if they want to stay, we need to make sure that their rights are protected. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very good observation and also comment. I think it's not a question, it's your, a statement. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Arvind, and I'm working in an organization called IGSS New Delhi. I'm mostly handling urban issues, so just have a question on understanding the whole framework aspect of how migration connects with climate change. Firstly, a wonderful panel here, lots of wonderful ideas and perspectives that we got to hear. So the question is that if you look at India, that we have a draft migration policy framework which has not been finalized for the longest time. We have a climate which is under the Ministry of Forest and Environment and Climate Change. And that's one sort of a box in which you have put them there. You have aspects of labor, livelihoods, little bit that talked about migrant workers in the 1970s, but nothing in the immediate. And that's with the Ministry of Labor and Employment. And then you have the Ministry of Housing, Urban Affairs that talks about cities, that receives a lot of these migrants, but doesn't really have anything except a rental housing policy for migrants, right? This is the kind of framework that exists, and of course disasters and the whole concept of how the Disaster Management Act just looks at a disaster. So this is how the policy is structured, or the lack of policy is visible in all these departments, and the lack of interconnectedness. And climate change is only there in this section of climate change and ministry handling climate change, but hardly reflecting anywhere else. So that is the state in India right now. I hope and I think Bangladesh would be doing much better than this, hopefully. So I just really want to understand what is the framework right now that's operating in Bangladesh? And maybe a last point to, let's say, Christian here, of are there any countries that are doing better than this? Or doing at least something than what we are doing right now? Yeah.
Okay, we'll take maybe more questions if I have. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Chase Ford. I'm from Vermont Law School in the USA, and I'm a party to Micronesia. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations this evening. In terms of implementing all these really wonderful on-the-ground community solutions, I was hoping if you could discuss a little bit about the forms of resistance, if any, whether it be political, economic, or legal, that you and your organizations have been facing, and then in reflecting on Mr. Wolf's presentation, if a revision of the legal framework for displaced people would help address those forms of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything? Yes.
I'm not sure that whether I'm speaking right or wrong, but just it came into my mind. I think it would also be good if we speak with this climate change related migration and displacement along with it, like human induced, like human factors that are also actually contributing to this migration and displacement. For example, like we actually like a cross-boundary information sharing, especially the forecast, we can do that, but that is not happening. That is also actually like intensifying the disaster situation. At the same time, for example, the way we are managing the rivers, the way we are managing the water bodies, the way we are actually dredging, are they really planned or not planned? So I think when we speak about the migration and displacement, if we also include these factors that actually humans are contributing, we are contributing, that could actually be more holistic. Thank you.
Now I'd like to request the panel speaker to respond to the questions, particularly Vikrant, because there is a particular question from this gentleman in relation to how to mainstream the debate and discussion to the other sectoral or ministerial plans and policies. So far, climate change and also displacement and migration is a sidelined issue, not captured or taken by the other ministerial kind of things. So is there any scope or hope or evidences of that?
I think what I understood the question was more directed toward Bangladesh, that what's the way it's happening in Bangladesh. So there is a whole lot of different laws that are addressing, the migrant population in India. That's what I think is Unni has spoken about, but it's more about how it is being done in Bangladesh. So maybe speakers from Bangladesh who would like
Junapa can take this.
Me? Okay. Though I thought I was going to answer your question more.
Okay, you can cover whatever you like.
Okay, so let me just say, I think a lot of this ministerial issues, I think, go on in all the countries where there's disaster, because I think this is something which is just, it's like in England, I don't think it's needed so much, it was already, it's still not facing this disaster. But we started off in isolated pockets of ministries, and now they're trying to put them together, and that also includes the refugees coming in. So more or less, though there are some interministerial work going on, we've got the disaster ministry, and then we've got the, they do share a bit, but I think a lot more interministerial and intergovernmental work has to be done. So it's not so different from India. Right. It's not so different from India. To answer, just touching on what you said, I think migration happens for many reasons. So you start off with poverty. You start off with poverty, and then there are so many things, demography. Then, so really there is a whole heap of things, the ones that you mentioned, of course, and so it's not only management of an issue, but I think it's a lot more holistic. Many things which lead to it. And about your resistance, when we started working, when you go to real remote areas, I think it's far beyond, the state of the people are such that when you bring in something which they know are creating an opportunity to them, giving them dignity and hope. People are not stupid, they don't resist. Now you come to a different category, let's say the ultra poor, those who have received nothing. That's what I'm talking about. They cannot resist. Anything you bring to them is manna from heaven. You know, they want it. It's your then the responsibility changes. It's your responsibility to give it in a way it doesn't provoke wrong actions, doesn't give rise to corruptions, doesn't give rise to internal feud. For example, we never work only with women because that is upsetting a whole family circuit. You know, women are there more present, but we never say it's only for women. It's men and women all welcome. So, you know, it's also a way of dealing with respect to community, the people, the societal norms. So when I think an organization does that, I think the resistance from the people does not come. Resistance, you know, resistance can come from an outside factor. It can come from other organizations who have maybe at another level, you know, if they're already working there, and then maybe it's there's a conflict of interest. However, one needs to bridge that gap and work together, and all these good things that's supposed to happen. There can be issues from the government, but you know, I've been working for 21 years, and quite different from many what others say. If you are doing something without a hidden agenda, and something which it becomes exemplary in the quality of output and the impact that happens, you do not meet so much resistance from the government as people say that you do. It's not true. You know, everybody wants to be part of something which is good. And regarding draft, you know, legal changes, certainly legal changes, because, you know, I think the issues of climate has become so drastically in front of our face that unless we have new systems, for example, for the education in the Chaudhary, education in the coastal belt, migrant communities, all these need to be put in now, and you cannot sit down in the center of the government in Dhaka or in the capital and think that you can make a panacea of how to work throughout any country. Any country which is touched by disaster needs to be, their policies need to be changed so that each area the disaster comes in, the policies are changed. Just one small example and then I stop. For example, education. In the areas we are working, there are millions of people. Okay? You can't get one person who has passed their metric to remain in that island. So you have to take people from the community and make them into teachers. Teachers will not come there because it's too far away, too dangerous, too long, whatever. And to take a boat and go, it's like 1,000 taka. The government doesn't have any policy of education for these areas. So how are you expecting that the schools which you've built are going to work? So these, even in the Howards is different, in the coastal belts is different. So policy changes, if it hasn't happened earlier, has to happen today, and this is a direct impact of why climate, you know, the change needs to come in as part of the climate issues which are in our country.
Thank you. Rushati, you want to say something?
Law.
Yeah, I just want to tell a little bit of story. Like, loss and damage is not loss and damage is an old thing. It's not new. And heating disaster in this Bay of Bengal belt or in the South Asian belts is it is also happening from past, but the frequency have already increased. There is if you punch someone continuously, then he or she will not able to stand anymore. So this migrant communities are the reason. I mean, they are migrating because they are heating. I mean, these disasters are hitting each and in a year. It's like hitting 4 to 5 times. Like yesterday, Chennai has been hit. Today Chennai has been hit by a cyclone. So these are the examples of repeating in a year in every country.
Yeah.
migration is, climate-induced migration is not a, it's for 4 to 5 years, we can say, not before that. Before that, migration was there, but there, that was considered as an economic development issue, not because of, because climate is hitting that place. So, policies are there, but they are in some different formats, not in the name of migration or in the name of displacement or for the favor of the displaced communities, or policies are there for the women and children, policies are there for human trafficking and every places, but they are in some different languages, not on the languages what this climate induced migration is related to. So while we were working on this, we are working on this South Asian countries. These policies, these policies are now our main aim to make sure that whether these policies are to be drafted in a or in a favorable way, that so that it is more prone for those migrant people, and they get more help from them.
Thank you very much. And already we have used our time, 90 minutes. Thank you very much for your presence and patience to be here. I said that this is hard time because we have started early in the morning, so this is a bit of late evening. So thank you very much, the panelists, for your discussion, for your contribution to the discussion, and thank you very much, dear audiences, for staying with us for a long time. Thank you.